In the following video, we will be exploring some of the most advanced uses of the workflow pattern. As mentioned in the previous video, which was initiation of a process from a Nexus object, most of the API is organized on a hierarchy, with the server at the top. That means the server represents the entry point to all the features that we have seen so far, including the models, the execution of those models, and the user information of those people that execute them. In this particular video, we will be focusing on this object and the features it enables us to include in our Nexus code. The workflow server has a series of properties that allows us to get information about the execution environment. Those include the current work session of the log user, the user information of the log user, and the global settings for the entire server. Besides those properties, the server object gives us access to a series of methods and functionalities which include connect and disconnect into our gexplode session, provided we know the username and password. This session is the one the rest of the code in Nexus will use to execute, and the user will be the one returned in current user. So some functionalities described next might fail if the current user does not have the proper privileges. List all process definitions given a series of filters in a particular order, or directly access a single process definition by using its ID or name. List all activities in a process using some extra filters, or directly accessing one using its ID or name. List all instances or executions of workflow processes using some filters, or getting access to a single one using its ID. List all work items that define those instances, or get access to a single one using its ID. Get access to all calendars defined in a server with its holiday and workday definition, as well as getting access to a single one if we know its ID or name. Get access to all nodes in the processes, that is, obtain information about every activity, every condition, event node, and the link between them. Get access to the organizational model defined on the server. Get access to the events repository in order to access the log information of the server, and get access to the content repository in order to access the content of documents in the server. For many of these features, the filter data type is an important part of the proper use of the functionality. The object is a superset of all possible filters that might be interesting to us to include when accessing a series of instances, work items, or such objects. Without it, we would be forced to filter in the application on the complete collection, which can be extremely ineffective in production environments that often works with hundreds of processes and millions of work items. Not all filters apply to all functions, but it is still useful to know which ones apply where in order to maximize our performance in the use of the API. It is also important to know, however, that using a filter that does not apply to a feature does not trigger an error. The user filter applies to every entity regulated by the presence of a user, like assigned work items, triggered events, or document custodians. The role filter applies to entities regulated by roles, like candidates for an activity or users with some role assigned. The organizational unit filter applies to entities regulated by them, like users and roles. The organizational unit definition filter applies to listing organizational units. The process definition filter applies to all entities that include a process definition. Those include work items, process instances, activities, and candidates roles. The process instance filter applies to entities that are defined by an instance, which include documents, work items, and assigned roles. The subject filter applies to the subject of the instances and the work items. This filter is case sensitive. The activity filter applies to work items and candidate roles of that activity. The from and to filters define a lower and upper limit to the creation date of documents, events, process instances, and work items. The name filter applies to the descriptive name of document types, the title of documents, and the names of roles, restriction, user, task, and process definitions. All these filters are also case sensitive. The start and limit filters are used to improve the performance of getting several items to use some functionalities like reporting or paging. Start specifies the offset of the dataset retrieved, while limit specifies the amount of offset returned. Most modern databases support this functionality at the level of the server instead of the driver, improving bandwidth and transfer time with the database, although there might be some restrictions to its use. For example, SQL Server supports this functionality since 2012, but it requires an order to be specified. The state filter includes objects that are affected by the workflow state machine, so it can be used to filter process definition, instances, work items, and documents. This filter is quite complex, since it has a series of possible values, and not all of them apply to the different object types. So let's dig in a little further. When used with process definitions, they can be either enabled, meaning new instances can be created, or disabled, so new instances of that definition can be created. When used on process instances, they can be open running, which means an instance is executed and created normally, open not running suspended, which is when the functionality of suspend in the instance is executed, the state is changed to this state. Also, all subprocesses and active work items are changed to suspended to ensure no part of the instance remain active. Close completed, which is the state used when an instance is completed normally. Close aborted, which is similar to suspended. When the functionality of abort the instance is executed, said instance and all its components are set to this state. Close terminated. This state is used when the instance is terminated unexpectedly, particularly through a deadline. When used on a work item, the state filter can be open active ready when the work item is created, open active assigned when it has been created or taken by a user, open active in process when the work item is in execution, that is, after it was taken but before it was sent, or close complete when the work item was sent back and completed successfully. Let's return to the rest of the filters. The filter created from and created by works similarly to from and to. In fact, they are maintained for compatibility reasons. The filters ended from and ended by work similarly to the previous ones, but for objects that have a termination date, like work items and instances. It is important to detail that work items that are currently open will be cut down if these filters are specified. In case you are interested in currently open instances, you should use the state filter instead. The search filter can be used to filter a combination of different attributes in different entities. For work items, it filters by its subject, its name, its process name, its task name, or its username. For users, it filters by code, name, or email. For restrictions, it filters by code or value. For processes, it filters by name and description. For instances, it filters by its subject, its process name, or its username, and for documents it's filtered by title or responsible user. And finally, the workflow priority filter can be used to filter work items and instances by their set priority, the options being high, normal priority, and low priority. Another object that we have to consider when programming with GeneXus on the API is the workflow context. Generally, objects that have to be used as gateway require the following parameters: the process definition, the process instance, and the work item to identify where in the workflow we are standing. However, since the latest versions of GeneXus, we have introduced the workflow context, which is defined automatically on every transaction and web panel that is called from workflow and includes the process definition that is currently running, the process instance that is currently running, and the current work item. Also, the functionality to check the rights of a particular user with a particular activity. This means that the same code in the same object will behave differently whether it's executed in the workflow or in an external URL. Another important data type that requires our attention is the user. The workflow user data type expands on the properties that define a user in workflow, which include a unique username, a full name, an email, which is optional and not unique, the access level, defining if the user can execute this API on other users or only on itself, a set of roles, organizational units, and restrictions, an external code, which is often used to interface with other modules, like for example the GeneXus Access Manager, and whether the user is currently connected, logged, or out of office. In the case of out of office, the properties also includes its substitute. Besides those properties, the data type includes a lot of functionality. You can get the user current for list, or the list of processes the user has rights to start, using the filters described before. Provided your user has enough access level, you can also get the roles defined by the organizational unit that the user has. You can assign or remove roles, organizational units, and restrictions from these and other users. Also, as an administrator, you can block or enable a user or set it as out of office, in which case you may also select another user as its substitute. Finally, you can force to rebuild the work list. Doing so will reapply all rules related to candidate roles for the work items the user may have, considering the proper restrictions and organizational units in order to, in essence, refresh the list of items a user may take and execute. The server installation is configured by default to perform these calculations for any change in the user rights as well as movements in the state machine. But since they can be resource intensive and time consuming in environments with dozens of roles, hundreds of users, and millions of work items, you are given the option to disable the automatic rebuild and manually trigger it under certain conditions. For example, when a user logs in. The last set of data types we would like to discuss are the roles, restrictions, and organizational units. Even when they are conceptually different and have different use cases, they share the characteristic that they are modifiers to define what a user can and can't do. As such, all of them have a name or a value, and also the functionalities to add or remove users to the metadata. This video has covered an important part of the data types and functionalities provided by Workflow to access within the GeneXus code. In the next video, we will explain how all these features can be used to create, integrate, and customize our own workflow client.